So, how does a modern American community actually get started? Well, sometimes the story isn't just about pioneers with big dreams. Sometimes it's a story written by ice and by fire, by brutal conflict, and even total abandonment. Today, we are diving into the absolutely wild history of Todd County, Minnesota, to see how a community can literally be forged from an empty wilderness. Take a look. This is Long Prairie today. It looks pretty peaceful, right? Established. But to really get how it got here, we have to go back, way back, before a single one of these buildings stood, to a time when the land itself was being violently carved up by glaciers, and then fought over in battle. So here's our roadmap. We're going to follow this story right from the ground up. First, how the land was literally carved by ice. Then, we'll get into the human conflicts that defined it, the incredible rise and fall of its first settlement, a moment when it was completely emptied out, and finally, how a new community was forged against all odds. Okay, so our story begins with the land itself. Before any people showed up, the geology of this place was the main character, setting this huge stage for all the human drama that was about to unfold. And when I say huge, I mean it. We're talking about a massive stage, over 645,000 acres. That is an absolutely immense canvas of forests and prairies and lakes, all of it scraped and carved out by the retreat of ancient ice sheets. And this was its lifeblood. All these rivers, they all drain into the mighty Mississippi Basin. But they weren't just features on a map. No way. They were the original highways. They dictated the flow of animals, of early peoples, and eventually the very first settlers. Now this is fascinating. The glaciers left behind two totally different landscapes all in the same county. Over in the east, you get these dramatic high hills, some up to 200 feet. They're called terminal moraines. It's basically the giant pile of rock and junk the glacier pushed to its final stopping point, like a giant bulldozer. But in the west, the land is way smoother, just gently rolling. And this geological split would end up shaping everything that came next, from where you could farm to where people decided to build their homes. So the stage is set. The first human actors arrive, and this fertile land just packed with game and resources, well, it immediately became a prize worth fighting and dying for. For years, this land was the contested frontier between two powerful tribes. The Sioux, who were the original inhabitants, were gradually getting pushed west by the Chippewa. The U.S. government even stepped in around 1840 and, tried to draw a line on a map to keep them apart. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The fighting just kept going, making this a truly disputed and dangerous ground. So the first real, organized attempt to build a community here, well, it's a story of a sudden, massive boom and an even more sudden, spectacular bust. It basically created a ghost town. Okay, so check this out. In 1845, the government moves the Winnebago tribe here and sets up an agency. And it just exploded. Within just a few years, it's a town with 150 buildings and 1,000 acres of farmland. But by 1854, after a lot of conflict and trouble, the government just gave up. They moved the tribe out and abandoned the entire settlement. This quote from an early history, it just perfectly captures that sense of loss. You have to imagine it. One minute, it's this thriving center of activity, and the next, just silence. The bustle was completely gone. So by the end of 1859, how many people were left in that once populous and bustling town? 3. Just 3 families. The first big attempt at building a community here had failed spectacularly. But believe it or not, the story gets even more dramatic. The few families that were left, along with some other scattered settlers, were about to face something so terrifying it would basically wipe the county clean of people, returning it to an uninhabited wilderness. Seriously, just think about that for a second. What could possibly be so frightening that it would make these hardy, tough-as-nails pioneers abandon everything they had built, their homes, their farms, their entire lives? The answer? The Sioux outbreak of 1862. It was a violent, bloody conflict that erupted to the south, but sent waves of absolute panic across the entire frontier. When news of the violence reached the scattered settlers in Todd County, they just fled. They ran for their lives. And the result was just astonishing. The entire county was abandoned. It literally reverted back to the wilderness it had been just a few years before. The slate was completely wiped clean. Well, almost clean. In this incredible act of defiance, one man, A.D. Brower, flat out refused to leave. He and his family stayed right there on their farm, protected by a group of friendly Chippewas. And because he never left, he became the county's oldest continuous resident. What a story. And that brings us to our final chapter. After the Civil War and the outbreak, the land was empty. It was going to take immense courage for people to come back and try all over again, to forge a new beginning from the ashes of the old one. This is how one of the key figures in the resettlement, a guy named General Van Cleve, was described. And that quality, fearlessness, that is exactly what it took to tame this frontier all over again. And this guy, he embodied the grit of that era. The source material tells us about a time a Sioux raiding party chased a Chippewa girl who worked for him right into his house. He stood them down alone. Another time, he walked into a hotel and single-handedly defied a mob that was planning to attack Long Prairie. I mean, this was the kind of character of the people who were going to rebuild this place. So how did they actually do it? Well, it happened step by step. First, the original families who had fled started to slowly trickle back in. Then, new settlers, a lot of them Civil War veterans, began claiming land. And this is crucial. They established businesses, a sawmill, stores, a hotel, the real building blocks of a town. And finally, neighborhoods started to form, creating the permanent community that's still there today. And this is the result. This wasn't just a collection of cabins anymore, a big hotel, a proper church. These were symbols of permanence. It was like a declaration that this time they were here to stay. This was no longer a temporary agency or a ghost town. It was a home. You know, the story of Todd County is unique, but its themes are so universal. It leaves us with a really fascinating question. How many of our own communities, the ones that seem so stable and permanent today, were also forged in a fire of hope, disaster, and just incredible human resilience?